Villages in Minecraft are a common and incredibly useful generation, but there is more to them than you might think, so from what buildings you should raid to how villages actually work, learn it all in this village guide. So the first question really is, how do you find villages? They are very common, but it is not uncommon to have trouble finding this structure, as of course they do generate in a lot of biomes, but not in every biome. Well, the first thing you want to do if you're trying to find a village is decide what biome you're trying to go for. Now it depends on where you are, of course, but there's only 6 main biomes that villages can generate in. We have the plains village like this, that can generate in the plains biome as well as the meadow biome, but the meadow biome almost always generates next to the plains biome. Next there's the desert village, which you guessed it only generates in the desert biome. There's also the Savanna village that only generates in that biome. We also have the snowy village that generates in the ice plains. And last but not least, the Taiga village, which generates in the Taiga biome but not in the mega taiga. And we'll break down all these villages in a second here. The other way you can find villages is with the Seed Finder chunk base. I know I reference this on a lot of videos, but it is the most surefire way of finding any generated structure in the game. And your best method if you don't want to do that is basically just to explore in random directions in the main biome types that villages can generate in. So for instance, don't go exploring through, let's say, a jagged peaks to try and find a snowy village, as that would only be in the snow plains biome and not the jagged peaks, even though they both have snow. So first we have the plains village generating in the plains and meadow biome. These villages resemble somewhat the original village structures, with some of the old church and blacksmith buildings resembling the old structures from before Village and Pillage. A lot of these structures have some white terracotta in them, which does match the English aesthetic of these well. There's a lot of hay bales that generate in this biome. I've also found it tends to be more common to find blacksmiths here. And occasionally there'll be the loot chest here or there, with some loot for, let's say, the cartographer or just a general villager house, with of course the blacksmith having a lot of that. And with the loot in the chests, the beds and the hay here, as well as the sampling of basically every crop type in the farmland, finding a village early game can really set you up long term with a big food source, and enough bread to last you till you can make a giant food farm. The next type of village is the desert village. Now this one generated partially in the mesa biome, and it is not uncommon for a village to generate across multiple biomes, but of course the biome that it starts generating in, that is the biome that the village type will be. So for instance, you would not find a desert village that is fully within the mesa biome, at least part of it would have to be in the desert biome. Now this one generated incredibly strangely, with a lot of the structure actually being in this cave, and something that's sort of cool about villages in 1.18 and onwards is that you can get some very strange generation with it. With a lot of the world generation being a bit larger than life, the villages can stick out a bit, but overall I think it looks really cool. And actually in this specific village we have 2 of these tower structures right next to each other like this, as you can see, which is very rare, but it is cool to see some of the generation here. And actually at the top of these towers there's oftentimes some interesting desert oriented loot. Although it's nothing too crazy, you can still find some cactuses and some wheat. And in general style, most of this is made out of sandstone, blending in with the desert quite well, and also the occasional bit of the terracotta there. And the paths are smooth sandstone, but it's good to be aware of, as I found the loot in this village isn't always as good as in most types of villages. Next we have the Taiga village. Now this type of village is often a bit strangely set up, and I found that of all the village types it seems the most messy in a sense, but still definitely a cool village generation. You can see this one went on the side of a mountain, with even some of the villagers and villager buildings being on the cliffside there. The buildings here, as you would guess, are made out of the spruce wood, with a lot of cobblestone there. And there's also a heavy use of trapdoor in this generation, with some interesting things like weaponsmiths and sometimes even armor stands being able to be seen. You can also get some decent loot in some of these buildings, depending on what type of villager it is. And their generation focuses somewhat around some of the aspects of the Taiga update of 1.14. And there's a heavy use of campfires. Even right here you can see there's a hay bale beneath this campfire, so that the smoke goes higher up, sort of teaching players that didn't know that. And you can even see around there's also a lot of berry bushes that generate in, and a lot of smoke coming out of chimneys. This is a Savanna village. Now the Savanna village is a very interesting village type. Something I've always found strange about it is that every single time I found one, the generation seems to be broken on it. For instance, here we have a floating torch, Oftentimes the cropland will do very strange things as well. So for instance, sometimes you'll have seeds generated on top of paths. You'll just have floating seed blocks there. Also there's a lot of glitched water and strange farmland in places it shouldn't be. But overall, even though this is quite a messy village type, I found it's quite a nice one to try and fix up. And with all the acacia logs here, like the very heavy use of acacia logs throughout all these buildings, if you did want to take down the village for any reason, there is a massive source of acacia there. There's an example right here actually of the seeds being where they shouldn't. So oftentimes if you want something rare in your world, you can find one of these. And I promise I did not set this up, and I literally just realized, as I said there's rare things here, there is a pink sheep at this village, so apparently there is always a lot of rare things here. But all coincidences aside, this is definitely a cool village type. There's also good use of terracotta and banners in these houses, which you don't see in many others. And a lot of these houses are also sort of on pillars like this, maybe to show that the land would sometimes flood. And last but not least, we have the snow biome village, also known as the snowy village. Now this one's rather odd considering it generates next to a swamp. That's definitely very rare for such a warm biome to generate next to such a cold biome. But either way, this village is rather interesting. It does often generate in some really dramatic and amazing terrain, because some of the snow biomes have some cool generation in them, like the snowy slopes. Now these houses tend to have a lot of blocks that make them up, and are mainly comprised of stripped spruce as well as some planks. The loot chests can have some great stuff in them, including seeds, potatoes, snowballs, and emeralds. And there is a really cool blacksmith chest structure here that has a diorite blacksmith's house. Now I have no idea if that copper is supposed to generate there or not, but I don't think it's supposed to either way. You can see in here you can get some awesome stuff like obsidian, bread, apples, iron boots, iron helmets, just of course your general blacksmith loot, meaning you can get diamonds and some other really good stuff there as well. As snow plains tend to be quite large, it's also very common with this type of village, as well as with the desert village and the savanna village, to be able to see other snow type villages in the distance depending on how these things generate. I've also found you'll sometimes find the standard igloo structures that generate in here, sometimes having basements with the witch and the conversion area and all of that. And some of these even feature blue ice, which can be really good to harvest if you want some of that, as it's one of the only naturally generated ways to get that outside of the iceberg biome. But there's one type of village I've not covered here, and no, it's not a different biome type, it's actually a very special type that only 2% of villages generate in as. And that is the zombified, also known as abandoned village. Now, these can be any village type, so for instance this one right here is acacia. I have found that these often tend to be the plains type village, but that could just be coincidence. More or less what happens is a bunch of blocks in the generation turn into cobwebs. If it is a village type that has cobblestone in it, then a big amount of the cobblestone will turn into mossy cobblestone. And one of my favorite Easter eggs is that windows which can be broken are also always brown if they're not broken. You might be wondering, why are the windows brown on the zombie village? Well, what it's basically meant to do is it's meant to represent dirty windows that the villagers have not cleaned. And I kind of like this because there's very few references in the game to time and things degrading over time needing to be taken care of, but with those villager windows turning brown, you can see just a little bit of history there that just turning glass one color is really able to successfully accomplish. Most of these buildings also generate with a zombie villager inside of them. Not all, but a bunch of them do. And so because of that, if you actually want to restore one of these and save the zombie villagers, I would suggest only coming here at night, as generally what will happen is you'll come here, they'll run outside of the buildings and burn up in the sun. Now these are literally 2% of villages that spawn in as this, so if you find one it is very rare, although there are seed finders that can help you find this. And I would say it's actually a really cool challenge, as you have this sort of broken down village that you can fix up if you want, or you could even just get rid of it. Really provides a cool choice to the player. But either way, the AI of the zombie villager is meant to make them not run out in the sun and burn, but I have found that they do run out into the sun and burn anyway, and so definitely coming here at night if you want to successfully save this is a must. But the treasure in the chests is the exact same, so if you're just coming to a village to loot it, this can actually be great, as you can grab this as well as the sometimes rare cobwebs. Now something interesting is that the abandoned villages do still generate with stray cats as well as farm animals if that was part of the structure, which sort of shows that it was the zombies that took this over, as it wasn't just something that killed all the mobs here, they just simply zombified the villagers. It definitely adds some history to the game. If you're running through a village to loot it, how do you successfully raid a village, grabbing only the things that are important? Well, I would suggest looking inside of any large houses in the village, as you can find some interesting loot in there. Nothing crazy, but if you want some decent loot you can find that. Also, the crop stockpiles are really good. So for instance, hay bales, one hay bale is 9 wheat, which even in later game can be somewhat hard to get 9 wheat, although it's not always the most useful thing. Definitely for breeding your animals up, this could be a big boost that you need. Getting melons here is great, as you don't have to worry about going to a jungle to find them. These do only generate in the savanna villages, but still if you're here, savannas and jungles are not necessarily next to each other, and so because of that, this can be a great shortcut to get yourself some melons to plant. And basically every village has that, as of course there's wheat seeds in almost every village. The plains village is also especially useful if you're trying to get a bunch of crop types, as although you don't actually find pumpkins or melons here, what you do find is you find every single plantable crop type other than those, so you can find wheat seeds, potatoes, carrots, and even beetroot, sometimes all in the exact same farmland, which of course giving you access to even one of each of these items really unlocks a lot of things early game, and you can always leave one or two of these here if you want to give the villagers something to farm. It's up to you. And I would also suggest to look in the chests and other structures here, but undoubtedly the best source of loot from chests in any of the villages is from the blacksmith chests, and if you look in here there's chances for a lot of stuff. So this one just has apples and saplings. You can actually get a whole bunch of diamonds there, as well as obsidian. In fact, there's actually been blacksmith chests where people have found over 17 obsidian in them, as well as 5 diamonds, and so you can really get some crazy loot with these, even iron armor and stuff like that. Now, one other villager building you might not think of as being high loot is the librarian villager buildings. And of course, the librarian buildings give you a very quick way of getting bookshelves, really being able to level up your enchantment table quickly, with the desert one being the best, with 9 bookshelves being there. Also, there is a blacksmith chest at the desert villages as well, which is just as good as any of the other ones, giving you iron armor, saddles, all kinds of cool stuff. But more or less that's the main sources of loot from the village, so nothing crazy, but definitely a good structure to get your early game supplies at, and being so common, of course the villagers themselves are the most important source of loot here, considering what you can do with them. I would definitely suggest protecting any village that you find, as in the future those villagers are going to be much more useful than the bit of loot that they have at their village. So how does a village work? What are the mechanics behind making this group of blocks and mobs turn into a functioning villager society? Well, the first thing is that a village is really technically one bed and one villager. Now of course there can be more beds and more villagers, constituting a bigger village, but if you take a random villager somewhere with, let's say, a boat or a minecart, and you place one bed next to it and that villager claims that bed, and that is now counted by the game as being a village. You can actually farm raids this way by having one hidden villager with a bed next to it, so that there's no way that the raiders can destroy what they're trying to do. Now the center of the village is one of two things. It is either where there's the bell, which you can see right here is definitely the center of the village, with all these villagers talking and communing with each other at the central area, but if there is not a bell at the village, then it is the first bed that's been claimed by any villager, and interestingly enough there is sort of a hidden mechanic, where the first villager to claim a bed is known as the leader of the village, and that bed is the center of the village, so that's the meeting place, again if there's not a bell. But there's basically no other mechanic with it other than that, although there is in Bedrock Edition some mechanics with iron farms that use the leader of the village, as it does predict some iron golems spawning there. So throughout their day the villagers wake up, then they'll come over to the center of the village and they'll congregate at that village center. That's a big feature of it, is if you're planning a village and you want them to go somewhere else other than their main central area, you can actually pick up and move that bell and make them go to a different central area if, let's say, this central area has something dangerous at it, or maybe you have your base near here and they're bothering you, you can move that somewhere else. Now the three things that interest villagers, it's basically the center of the village, their beds, and their jobs. So there's the residential villager buildings with just a bed in them and just a house, and then there are the job villager buildings. So for instance this one right here, we have a blast furnace, and potentially this villager, in fact yes right here, has turned into an armorer because it's interacted with the blast furnace. Now this villager will have sort of a route it goes on during the day, where basically it'll wake up at its residential house wherever its bed is claimed. Maybe its bed is claimed right here, but it definitely does not have to be right next to its job site. then it'll go from its bed over to the center of the village, then it'll go to its work at some point. It'll go between talking with villagers, being at the villager center, and working at its job site, then going to sleep a little bit earlier than the player can, probably to avoid zombie deaths. And speaking of zombie deaths, there's actually a very interesting mechanic with villagers. So if you have a very large village, I believe it has to have 20 beds at it, with claimed villagers for each bed, then at midnight there is a 1 in 10 chance for a zombie siege to spawn, which is a very large group of zombies generating in the center of the village. They don't actually go on the edge and go to the center, they actually just go in the very center of the village to start off with, and so walls will not protect you from this. Definitely something to be aware of if you have a massive village and are staying up near midnight, as it'll only spawn in right at midnight as that 1 in 10 chance. Something that's very odd is this mechanic has been in the game before the Village and Pillage, meaning this was basically the old raid mechanic before the pillagers or illagers were even thought up of. I do find it funny that it was not removed when the pillager update was added, but still this is a cool relic of the past, and I think it's technically here to answer the question of why zombies can sometimes drop carrots and potatoes, as of course the idea would be they're going around raiding villages, and if they're successful, they would come out with some of the crops. Here's some interesting villager trivia you might not know. The developer's original idea was that villages would be populated by pigmen, so not exactly zombified pigmen, but sort of like piglins before they added piglins. And I'm very glad they added villagers instead of pigmen. I definitely think adding villagers to Minecraft was a big reason of why it's successful. Trader llamas and the wandering trader can sometimes generate in at the center of a village, so not right next to the player as they often would normally, but specifically at the center of the village. I think this is an interesting mechanic, because it basically says that the wandering traders visit villagers and players, and potentially, if the player wasn't in the world, they'd only be visiting villagers. But I think the Wandering Trader is also an interesting lore mechanic, as it shows us as that Wandering Trader is visiting the villages and the players. Maybe that's where it's collecting all these items that it gives you as it travels across the world. And so interesting to see that its business is not fully dependent on commerce with the players, but also trading with the villagers. Now it is certainly not the case for this rather large village, but there is a chance for a village to generate with absolutely no beds in it. Sometimes they'll have villagers in them, but no beds in it, and so because of that and that really rare chance, a village will generate not technically being a village. And it's a very odd thing because unless you have one villager claiming one bed within a village, then that's not counted as a village. And I have rarely found villages like this where there's literally one building or maybe two buildings, but they're both job buildings, they're not residential buildings, and so you can have this strange village paradox. Very rarely you'll find a village that is intersecting a cave or even an abandoned mine shaft in a cave, with a bunch of the buildings generating deep down within the caves. It's very strange to find this, but it's actually not that uncommon, and sometimes you can even find certain buildings of the village that generate incredibly low down, where as soon as the villagers generate in, they'll instantly be killed by a zombie. Anyway, that is the ultimate guide to villages. I will have more villager related videos coming out soon as I want to cover every single aspect of them. I will see you in the next one, and don't forget to give your favorite iron golem a fist bump for being a great protector of the village. Maybe too good of a protector.